The year was 1847, and the skies above Milan, Ohio, were said to have held an unusual stillness, a silence so profound that even the crickets faltered and the owls withheld their midnight songs, as though the natural world itself anticipated the arrival of something that did not belong entirely to its order. And in that stillness, Thomas Alva Edison entered the world, not with the robust cry of most infants, but with a strained and broken sound, a hesitant wail that seemed more like the stuttering pulse of a machine warming to life than the lungs of a newborn. And some claimed the candles in the room dimmed and flared with his breaths, as though testing their allegiance to him. In the days that followed, neighbors would whisper of flickers in the lamps, of shadows moving oddly when Nancy Edison carried her son through the modest brick house. And though his father Samuel scoffed at such talk, dismissing it as superstition, Nancy felt the weight of it when the boy's eyes lingered too long on the horizon, or when his tiny fingers traced patterns in the air that seemed deliberate, as though he were sketching unseen diagrams. Illnesses robbed him of much of his hearing in early childhood, yet where others saw tragedy, Thomas saw a new sense, for in the absence of ordinary sound, he discovered subtler vibrations, the trembling of floorboards beneath heavy footsteps, the faint thrum of train wheels approaching long before they appeared, the strange resonance of metals struck together in the dark, and he would tilt his head toward these invisible frequencies with a seriousness that unsettled those who watched, as if he were eavesdropping on voices carried not by air, but by some deeper current. While other boys chased games in the dust, he disassembled watches, cracked open toys, stole bits of wire and tin to build contraptions that clicked and whirred briefly before collapsing. Yet in each failure he seemed satisfied, as though it confirmed some fragment of a pattern only he could sense. His mother, determined that he not be broken by teachers who called him slow, schooled him at home and watched as he devoured histories, philosophies, and chemistry manuals. But she sometimes trembled when she found him awake at dawn, scribbling symbols and diagrams on his sheets, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though the boy had spent the night not in sleep, but in congress with something vast and unseeable. By 12, he worked on the Grand Trunk Railroad, selling candy and newspapers. But to him, the locomotives were not mere machines of iron and fire. They were creatures alive with hidden voices, beasts that screamed smoke and devoured distance. And he loved to stand within their trembling bodies, palm pressed against steel walls, whispering as if in conversation. He converted part of a baggage car into a laboratory, carrying jars of powders and acids, filling the air with smoke and strange scents until one experiment scorched the floorboards and cost him his workspace. Yet the loss only deepened his hunger. At telegraph stations along the rails he lingered, his head cocked near wires strung across the land, listening with a peculiar intensity. And once, when asked what he thought he heard, he answered simply, "The future." And though the operator laughed, the boy's calm certainty unnerved him. Nights brought storms, lightning dancing on horizons, and Edison swore he could hear voices braided into the static, voices that spoke in rhythms not yet sent, conversations that did not yet exist, and he filled notebooks with strange sequences of dots and dashes, patterns that no operator could recognize. When he saved a station master's child from a runaway train, gratitude gave him the chance to study telegraphy formally, and he took to it with unholy fervor, his fingers striking keys as though his bones already knew the language. Yet even here, anomalies followed him. For often the messages he received carried excess pulses, ghostly interruptions, not from any sender on the line, and he transcribed them with a zeal approaching madness. One night he dared to answer, tapping back into the silence, and to his astonishment, the receiver replied, not with language, but with the pulsing beat of something alive, a pattern like a heart thrumming across the wires. And he would never forget the cold that spread through him as he realized the network of wires might be less a tool and more a doorway. In his late teens, he built crude laboratories in basements and cellars, surrounding himself with copper plates, wires, and jars that crackled faintly with blue sparks. And neighbors claimed that on certain nights, pale lights glowed from beneath the earth, as if a second moon had been buried there, while Edison himself awoke from fevered dreams of impossible cities. their streets illuminated by suns and glass, their carriages flying without horses, their voices carried inside glowing boxes small enough to cradle in one hand, and in his notebooks he scrawled half-legible confessions. Light is not born, it is summoned. Silence has its rhythm. I can hear tomorrow if I listen long enough. And when Nancy read them, her blood chilled, for she feared her son was wandering too close to something meant to remain hidden. Yet he pressed forward, his deafness becoming an advantage, for in his quiet world the faintest vibrations grew louder, and he often claimed that silence itself was a code, a fabric he was learning to read, and in this way his condition was less a curse than an initiation. By 1869, restlessness consumed him, and he left Ohio, carrying with him little more than his books, tools, and journals, bursting with impossible designs. And though he told his family he sought work in Boston or New York as a telegraph operator, those who saw him depart remembered that the lamps along the street flickered as he passed, and one old man swore the moon burned brighter, stretching shadows unnaturally long, as though marking the trail of a boy who was no longer merely a boy, but something aligned with currents greater than himself. For Edison was not simply an inventor in the making. He was a conduit, a summoner of fragments of the future, pulling them like sparks through the frail wires of the present. And the unsettling truth whispered in taverns and around hearths was that perhaps he was never entirely alone in his work. Perhaps the signals and visions had always been guiding him, unseen collaborators in the shaping of a destiny that would remake the world in fireless light and restless hum. The 1870s opened like a corridor of shifting shadows for Thomas Alva Edison, who by then had wandered through the networks of telegraph offices and the smoke-filled backrooms of cities where men dreamed of wealth rising and collapsing like tides. And though most saw in him only a pale and restless operator with untamed hair and an obsessive stare, there was in his movements something of a storm gathering, a hunger not satisfied with wires alone. For Edison had begun to sense that the invisible currents passing through copper were not mere signals, but arteries of some hidden organism stretching across the nation. And when he touched them, he felt as though he brushed against the veins of time itself. In Newark, he established his first real workshop, a cramped space reeking of oil, iron, and sweat, where night after night he and his assistants, half-mad boys barely older than himself, worked by flickering lamps until dawn, scribbling equations, hammering metals, and filling the air with sparks and fumes, their bodies becoming shadows fused into the rhythm of invention. And when they produced the improved stock ticker, the device that could transcribe the pulse of financial markets into printed letters, investors hailed Edison as a genius. Yet to him, the machine was not merely economic but prophetic, for he saw in its relentless printing of numbers a parallel to the beating heart of the world, a pulse that could be measured, predicted, bent to one's will. And he would sometimes lean close to the device when alone, listening not to the tape it produced, but to the subtle irregularities in its gears, convinced that if he could tune himself properly, he might catch whispers of patterns too vast for the human eye. Wealth followed, enough to expand his ambitions. Yet with money came suspicion, for Edison moved with an urgency that unsettled even his allies, as though he were racing against an invisible deadline, compelled by visions only he could see. And those visions sharpened when he relocated to Menlo Park in 1876, founding the laboratory that the newspapers would call an invention factory, but which his assistants sometimes described in hushed tones as a temple, a sanctum where reality itself was challenged nightly by experiments that bent the edges of known science. Menlo Park was unlike any place in the nation, a cluster of buildings surrounded by fields, glowing at odd hours with electric arcs that neighbors swore illuminated the sky like alien suns. And within its walls, Edison presided like a high priest of technology, demanding endless hours of labor, driving his team through cycles of exhaustion and exhilaration. For he believed the future could be forced to arrive early if only they sacrificed enough to summon it. And the men, caught between admiration and dread, obeyed, their hands blistered, their minds stretched thin, their dreams haunted by the crackle of wires. Here the phonograph was born, a device so uncanny that even Edison himself admitted unease when first he heard his own voice emerging from a cylinder of tinfoil, for it was as though the air had been tricked into remembering, as though time itself had grown porous. And when he played the machine for visitors, some laughed nervously, some gasped, and a few crossed themselves, whispering that it was not invention but necromancy, a conjuring of the dead into audible form. To Edison, however, the phonograph was a message, a confirmation that vibration could be trapped, harnessed, replayed, that the intangible could be bound into matter. And he began to wonder what other ghosts of reality might be captured if one only built the right prison of gears and wires. And in long nights he would place the phonograph beside his bed, replaying fragments of speech until he drifted into sleep, where dreams carried him into corridors of echoing voices that did not belong to any living throat. Yet even the phonograph was but a step toward the greater vision that burned inside him. The conquest of light, the summoning of illumination not from fickle flame, but from the deep structure of nature itself. And as the decade advanced, he pursued the incandescent lamp with a fury bordering on mania, burning filaments of every conceivable substance, imprisoning them within glass globes, demanding that his team record every trial no matter how small, until the laboratory became littered with failed vessels, broken bulbs like the husks of shattered stars, and assistants whispered that their master seemed less inventor than alchemist, transmuting failure into fuel for his obsession. He claimed he could hear the lamps speaking in their own faint tongue, that when a filament died, it exhaled a note too subtle for ordinary ears, and he, half deaf to human speech, could catch it clearly, as though his partial silence had attuned him to a deeper register. And though his men laughed uneasily, they admitted that Edison sometimes predicted a lamp's failure seconds before it happened, turning away just as the glass imploded. Journalists painted him as a wizard, newspapers as the Wizard of Menlo Park, and while the public thrilled at the image, those who worked closest to him knew there was a kernel of truth, for when he entered the workshop at midnight, eyes glinting in lamplight, hair shadowed against walls that pulsed with electric arcs, he seemed less man than conduit, drawing unseen knowledge into the world through sheer force of will. Businessmen came and went, some eager to exploit his inventions, others wary of the aura that clung to him. But Edison cared little for their politics, only for the work, only for the endless pursuit of the patterns he sensed just beyond reach. And he confessed once to an assistant that he did not so much invent as translate, that the machines already existed somewhere, in some dimension parallel to his own, and his task was merely to carve the right channel to let them through. In these years, his deafness deepened, yet rather than isolate him, it seemed to open new avenues, for he often pressed his head against machines, listening with the bones of his skull, muttering that vibrations spoke truths speech could not, and his notes grew stranger, filled with diagrams resembling constellations, equations intertwined with symbols that bore resemblance to no known mathematics. And when asked, he would only smile faintly and say, "Noise is a mask, silence is a signal." As the decade neared its close, he unveiled the perfected incandescent lamp, light without flame, and crowds gasped as Menlo Park glowed with steady brilliance. But for Edison, the achievement was only partial triumph, for though he had summoned light into obedience, he felt it still resisted him, flickering with secrets yet unrevealed. And in quiet moments, he confessed that every lamp was an eye, each filament a gaze into something watching from the other side. And he wondered if by bringing illumination into the world, he had also invited attention from realms that had previously ignored mankind. Yet he did not stop, could not stop, for the hunger that had driven him since boyhood burned hotter than ever. And as he looked out over the fields lit by his artificial suns, he whispered that the night itself was changing, that humanity had crossed an invisible threshold. And though the world celebrated him as inventor, he knew himself to be merely the first vessel of a force that intended to reshape everything. The decade of the 1880s opened like a furnace door, pouring heat and light across the world, and Thomas Alva Edison stood at its threshold, convinced that electricity was not merely a utility, but a kingdom waiting to be seized. A kingdom of invisible rivers flowing through copper veins. A kingdom that would crown him its sovereign, if only he could conquer its wild currents. Yet even as he expanded his networks of incandescent lamps, even as Menlo Park transformed into a beacon, seen for miles across the darkened countryside, shadows gathered at the edges of his dominion, for others had heard the same call of the hidden forces, and they too sought to become conduits for its power, and thus the so-called electric wars began. Though what newspapers described as rivalry between companies was, in truth, a collision of visions so vast and strange that reality itself seemed to warp beneath it. Edison clung to his direct current system, proud of its stability, its apparent safety, the way it pulsed like a steady heartbeat through neighborhoods he illuminated. But whispers spread of alternating current, a wilder, oscillating beast that leapt further and stronger, a current that could stretch across miles with minimal loss, a current courted by George Westinghouse, who assembled transformers like occult instruments designed to tame the oscillations. And lurking within this rising storm was Nikola Tesla, a figure almost spectral, tall, gaunt, eyes glowing with visions no one else could endure, who claimed to dream of entire machines fully formed, who spoke of currents not as inventions but as entities already alive, waiting for humanity to join their dance. And Edison, though dismissive in public, felt an unease coil inside him. For in Tesla he recognized a mirror darkly cast, another conduit touched by the same mysterious signals, yet interpreting them in a language alien to his own. The press relished the spectacle, calling it a battle of titans, wizard versus visionary. But within the laboratories, the struggle felt close to a ritual war, a clash of incantations and demonstrations designed not merely to persuade investors, but to awaken the public to one current or another. And Edison, unwilling to yield, launched a campaign of fear, showcasing the lethal danger of alternating current, staging demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted, their bodies twitching and smoking before horrified onlookers. And while he spoke of safety and responsibility, some whispered that Edison's eagerness to harness death betrayed a deeper knowledge, that he suspected electricity itself demanded sacrifice, that each spark carried within it a hunger for flesh. The rumors deepened when he lent his expertise to the design of the electric chair, the first machine of its kind, a throne of wires and straps through which alternating current would flow to extinguish life. And though Edison insisted it was Westinghouse's current that killed, the symbolism could not be ignored, for here was the Wizard of Menlo Park entwined with a device that fused punishment, technology, and ritual execution, as though electricity had chosen to reveal its darker aspect through him. Witnesses to the first electrocution spoke of flickering lights in the chamber, of a smell that lingered like burned ozone and scorched eternity, of a moment when the condemned's final scream seemed to harmonize with the hum of the wires, creating a resonance that unsettled even the most hardened officials. And some swore they felt the building tremble, as though something vast and unseen had taken notice. Meanwhile, Tesla moved in parallel, conjuring exhibitions of alternating current that dazzled crowds, streams of lightning leaping from his hands, coils singing with invisible music, bulbs glowing without wires as if filled with captive spirits. And though his manner was otherworldly, half detached from ordinary concerns, audiences sensed in him a channel to the future, a priest not of safety but of transcendence. And Westinghouse seized the opportunity to expand, building networks that spread across states, while Edison's direct current grid, bound by shorter distances, began to look provincial. Yet Edison refused surrender, and his nights grew stranger, filled with furious experiments, not only in illumination but in strange side projects, attempts to record thoughts, attempts to detect voices of the dead, machines that hissed and clicked in corners where assistants dared not linger, for they felt watched by unseen eyes. Edison would walk among his machines at midnight, whispering to them, pressing his skull against their humming surfaces, claiming that the currents carried messages not of this earth, that if one tuned the frequency correctly, the ether itself would speak. And though his men dismissed these ramblings, they could not deny that lamps sometimes flickered in his presence, pulsing in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be mere accidents. The newspapers continued to frame the conflict in economic terms, a struggle for contracts to light cities, to power industry. But beneath the commerce lay a deeper sense of apocalypse, as if the currents themselves had awakened and chosen human vessels to fight on their behalf. And the nation trembled at the possibilities, for every illuminated street was also a reminder that lightning, once the weapon of gods, now coursed through human neighborhoods, obedient yet unpredictable, and every electrocution, whether staged by Edison or engineered by law, suggested that this new Promethean fire might demand regular offerings. By 1888, the rivalry had intensified to fever pitch, with Westinghouse securing contracts for massive alternating current projects and Edison resorting to ever more desperate tactics. And Tesla, estranged from Edison, yet also apart from Westinghouse, wandered the edges like a prophet speaking of wireless power, of towers that could transmit energy across the globe, of resonance between earth and sky. And though many dismissed him as unhinged, others felt an uncanny truth in his visions, as though he had glimpsed the skeleton of the world and wished to tune it like a harp. Edison's own visions grew darker, his notebooks increasingly filled with sketches of machines shaped like coffins, circuits arranged in sigils resembling ancient runes, and he told one confidant that electricity was not invented but invited, that humanity had opened a door without understanding what waited on the other side. And though he swore he would master it, there were nights when even he admitted that mastery was illusion, that he was merely bargaining with a power too vast to name. The electric wars did not resolve in a single moment, but rather seeped into the fabric of the era, each city choosing sides, each household becoming an altar where one current or the other flickered to life. And though Westinghouse and Tesla ultimately triumphed in practical terms, their alternating current lighting the great expositions and powering the arteries of industry, Edison remained a figure both feared and revered. A man who had brought light, but also death. A man who had turned currents into commerce, yet also into ceremony. A man whose laboratories still burned through the night like watchtowers of some approaching age. By the decade's end, electricity was everywhere, threading through streets, factories, homes, a web of invisible fire, binding humanity tighter than any empire. And in the shadows of that web, Edison brooded, convinced that the true war had only begun, that beneath the visible rivalry of patents and power lines, another struggle raged, a struggle for the soul of mankind, for the allegiance of forces that were neither entirely mechanical nor entirely natural. And though the world cheered its progress, celebrating electric fairs with fireworks and brass bands, a few sensitive souls felt unease, whispering that in the hum of transformers, in the flicker of lamps, in the sudden stillness after a surge, there were voices waiting to be heard, voices that did not belong to men. The decade turned like a gear grinding against the teeth of eternity, and Thomas Alva Edison stepped into the 1890s not as a mere inventor, but as something stranger, something larger, something the newspapers hailed as the wizard, yet which the more superstitious whispered was a conjurer who trafficked with forces. Humanity was never meant to harness, and as factories multiplied and smokestacks scraped the sky, Edison's laboratories glowed through the nights with an intensity that felt less like industry and more like ritual, a ceaseless burning of lamps and filaments and minds, all bent to the task of transforming invisible whispers into tangible machines, machines that seemed less built than summoned, as though drawn out of another dimension into the trembling hands of his assistants. And with each new device, Edison felt both triumph and unease. For he no longer believed that he alone shaped these creations, but that he was merely translating patterns dictated by currents that rippled behind the skin of reality. The phonograph had already given him a reputation for capturing voices, but in the 1890s, he pressed deeper, insisting that the grooves on his cylinders could store not just sound, but traces of presence, imprints of the soul itself. And late at night, he recorded empty rooms, leaving the machine hissing and turning in the dark, only to play back faint whispers that none could account for, syllables fractured and stretched as if spoken through water. And though his assistants dismissed them as artifacts of vibration, Edison grew convinced he had discovered a portal, that the machine was not merely preserving sound, but acting as a sieve through which echoes of the beyond might slip. At the same time, he turned his gaze to motion, to the frozen ghosts of photographs that could be awakened into life if only the right mechanism could coax them to dance. And so the kinetoscope was born, a cabinet through which images flickered and moved, and audiences gasped to see men walking, women laughing, horses galloping, all trapped in mechanical resurrection. And Edison himself, watching those jerking figures, wondered whether he had stumbled into necromancy, whether these flickering shades were truly dead moments reanimated, or whether by replaying them, he was binding something unseen into the illusion of motion. For more than once he felt the eyes of an image meet his own with recognition, as though the ghosts on the strip of celluloid were aware of their imprisonment. In the newspapers, he was celebrated as the harbinger of a new age, a man who conquered silence and stillness, who gave humanity dominion over voice and image. Yet Edison himself grew increasingly uneasy, for he sensed in every coil of wire, in every strip of film, a hunger, a pressure, as if the inventions once summoned demanded to be fed. And so he expanded his empire feverishly, creating not only machines of entertainment, but ventures into mining, into chemical alchemy, into batteries that pulse like metallic hearts, into storage devices he claimed would preserve energy indefinitely. And though many of these enterprises faltered or failed, Edison spoke of them not as failures, but as incomplete conjurations, rituals broken midway through, leaving fragments of something unfinished scratching at the edges of reality. Investors demanded profits, the public demanded spectacle, but Edison's notebooks betrayed another obsession, filled with diagrams of circuits resembling occult mandalas, with phrases scrawled about the etheric lattice and the resonant soul wave, with calculations that curved not toward profit, but toward transcendence. And in private, he admitted to a confidant that he sought to build a device capable of communicating with the dead, though he insisted this was no seance trick, no parlor spiritualism, but a mechanical certainty, a methodical science. For if the soul was energy, then energy could be recorded, transmitted, replayed, and what greater invention could there be than to conquer the silence of the grave itself? Rumors spread that he had already succeeded, that strange experiments in his laboratories captured more than whispers, that assistants emerged pale and trembling after listening to cylinders that played back not music but screams, or worse, laughter, that lights flickered in patterns that matched the heartbeats of long-dead men, that the shadows of workers sometimes appeared in the wrong places, lagging behind their bodies like echoes out of sync. And though none of these tales could be confirmed, the aura around Edison grew darker, as though the title of wizard was no longer a compliment but a warning. Yet even as his inner world turned haunted, his public persona only grew grander, for the age itself demanded spectacle, and Edison provided it in abundance, filling expositions with glowing cities of light, dazzling audiences with films that played like dreams unspooled, projecting futures in which every household was bound to his machines. And behind the cheers lurked a deeper awe, for people felt instinctively that Edison's laboratories were not merely workshops but thresholds, places where the ordinary world grew thin and another reality shone through, a reality of humming coils, dancing sparks, and images too alive to be illusions. In this sense, he was not alone, for Tesla too spoke of unseen worlds, of wireless transmissions that could girdle the earth, of towers that could sip power from the very bones of the planet. And though their paths diverged, the echo of their rivalry still charged the air, as though the two men were not adversaries, but opposing poles of a cosmic machine, one grounded in industry and iron, the other in visions and storms. Yet both compelled by the same hidden current, the same whisper from beyond that lured them deeper into invention, as others are lured into prayer. As the century neared its close, Edison seemed restless, driven by forces even he could not fully name. And though he unveiled countless devices, from improved phonographs to more efficient lamps, his true passion lay in the hidden experiments, the ones he never revealed to the public. The boxes sealed in back rooms where wires coiled like serpents and glass tubes glowed with unearthly light. The devices he tested at midnight when the world was silent, when he believed the ether was most receptive, and he told those few who dared to listen that the new century would not merely bring progress, but revelation, that humanity was about to step across a threshold from which there could be no return. For once the invisible forces were fully invoked, they would not be dismissed. And men like himself were not masters, but merely the first vessels chosen to bear their arrival. The twilight of Thomas Alva Edison's life was not marked by the gentle fading of candles or the quiet dignity of age, but by a gathering of forces that seemed too immense for one human vessel to contain. For even as his body withered, his mind sharpened in unnatural ways, as though the closer he drew to death, the more clearly he could see the machinery behind existence itself. The cogs of time and the hidden wires of reality stretched taut across the firmament. And in the long corridors of Glenmont, his estate in West Orange, the air grew heavy with a charge that visitors could never quite explain, as if the walls themselves hummed with expectation, as though the very bricks were listening. Servants reported that clocks stopped when Edison entered a room, that light bulbs dimmed and flared with the rhythm of his failing heart, that his laboratory windows rattled though no wind blew, and they whispered among themselves that the master was not merely conducting experiments, but was already straddling two worlds, coaxing whispers from beyond the veil. Edison's obsession in these final years was not the phonograph, not the lamp, not even the motion picture that had dazzled cities. It was a project he never fully revealed to the public, a device he spoke of only in fragments, something he called the spirit telegraph. An invention meant not to capture sound or light, but to intercept consciousness itself, the residue of thought that lingered after flesh had failed. And though many dismissed it as the eccentricity of an old man chasing phantoms, those closest to him knew the depth of his conviction and the terror it stirred in him. For he was certain that death was not an end but a frequency, a transmission waiting to be tuned. And he could feel the receiver already buzzing inside his bones. He gathered his apprentices at night, men sworn to secrecy, and guided them through blueprints drawn in a trembling hand, diagrams of crystalline coils, oscillating chambers, and plates etched with patterns that looked less like engineering schematics and more like ritual sigils. Circuits, shaped as though designed to lure not current, but consciousness into their loops. And when one assistant asked him what power source could drive such a device, Edison whispered, "Not power, presence," before collapsing into a coughing fit that sprayed flecks of blood onto the very diagrams he refused to burn. For months, the mansion filled with strange deliveries, quartz cut to precise dimensions, metals not typically used in his other inventions, oils with scents sharp enough to sting the eyes, and rumors spread among the few who dared carry them that Edison had turned alchemist, transmuting his wealth into a final mad pursuit. His health waned, yet his experiments grew more feverish, and at night the estate shuddered with vibrations that carried into the town, rattling windows, sending dogs into frenzies, and mothers clutching their children swore they could hear voices in the static of their radios, though no station was tuned, whispers that spoke of a light without source and a city without sun. Edison himself rarely slept, prowling his lab with eyes wide, hands trembling yet precise, scribbling notes that veered into prophecy. The dead are not silent. Memory has mass. Thought is a circuit unfinished. Death is a relay, not a wall. He confided to his son Charles that he had nearly tuned the device, that he could already hear them faintly, not ghosts but echoes, intelligence carried on the same invisible waves that bore radio across oceans. And when Charles asked who they were, Edison replied with a hollow smile, "Not who, but what we become." Yet doubt gnawed at him, for he feared that whatever answered might not be the human soul, but something older, something that had always lurked between signals, patient and parasitic, waiting for a receiver strong enough to let it through. And still he pressed onward, unable to stop the momentum of a lifetime spent coaxing voices out of silence. In October of 1931, his body failed more rapidly. Lungs weak, heart stuttering, and his family gathered. But even as death loomed, he demanded to be wheeled into the laboratory, insisting that the device be completed, his final invention, the culmination not of decades, but of destinies. And on the night of October 17th, the mansion throbbed with energy, lights flickering like a heartbeat. The machine assembled before him, humming with a pitch too high for most ears, yet rattling deep in the chest like the growl of something colossal. Tubes glowed, coils trembled, and the air smelled of ozone and scorched copper as Edison, frail and nearly gone, placed trembling hands upon the controls and whispered that he was ready to cross, ready to prove that death was not darkness but a transmission waiting to be answered. And as he adjusted the dials, his assistants swore they felt the floor tilt, as though the laboratory had slipped from the house into some vast hollow space beyond measure. The machine roared with light, not steady, but pulsing in patterns that seemed deliberate, and from the receiver came not noise but a voice, not human yet intimate, a voice that did not speak in words but in the direct pressure of thought against thought. And Edison gasped, his mouth opening though no sound came, eyes wide with horror and awe. And those present would never agree on what he saw, but they remembered the way he clutched the machine, knuckles white, whispering again and again, "They are here! They are here! They are here!" The bulbs exploded, glass raining down, and in that violent flash the hum ceased. The light died, and Edison slumped back, breath rattling, heart failing. Yet on his lips lingered a faint smile, as though he had received an answer none of the living could ever know. Official records say he died at 3:21 a.m. on October 18, 1931, surrounded by family, but the assistants who fled that night never returned to Glenmont, leaving behind scattered papers and half-melted fragments of the machine. And they swore in hushed tones that his death was not a departure, but a transmission completed, that Edison had stepped into the very circuit he had built, his consciousness threaded into the frequencies that hum eternally through the ether. After his passing, rumors multiplied that Henry Ford had sealed a final vial of his last breath, believing it contained proof of spirit, that locked trunks of his notebooks vanished into private collections, that in certain storms when lightning split the sky near Menlo Park, one could still hear the faint crackle of a phonograph spinning, replaying voices that had never been recorded. Historians dismissed the spirit telegraph as myth, yet strange reports persisted from Glenmont, now a site of pilgrimage for the curious and the haunted, who claimed their radios sputtered with impossible broadcasts near the grounds, fragments of speech in Edison's voice, distorted but unmistakable, speaking of light beneath the skin of the world, of cities waiting in frequencies too narrow for flesh. Engineers who studied the scattered components found alloys that should not have existed, patterns etched with precision finer than human hands could manage, and some believed he had not built the machine alone, that unseen collaborators had guided his trembling fingers, using him as a vessel to open the road. To this day, the myth endures that Edison did not die but migrated, that he became less a man and more a signal, scattered across the electromagnetic sea, awaiting those brave and foolish enough to turn to his roots. And perhaps that is why even now, when power grid hums at night, when bulbs flicker without pause, when radios catch bursts of inexplicable static, there are those who pause and wonder if the old inventor still whispers from beyond, guiding wires and waves towards some unimaginable horizon. And if you stand in his laboratory at midnight, when the world is silent and the air still, some swear you can feel it too. A vibration not in your ears but in your skull. The faint sensation of being watched, not with malice but with expectation, as though Edison himself is still testing, still listening, still waiting for us to answer the call he began. The call that was never meant for one man, but for the species entire. A species he believed would one day conquer death, not through faith or philosophy, but through invention, through the machinery of the human will made manifest in steel, glass, and the unseen rivers of energy that bind the cosmos together.